Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to come to celebrate World Kidney Day with us, which this year is dedicated to women's kidney health. Chronic kidney disease prevalence is higher in women compared to men, and women's kidney health is intricately linked with pediatric health. So on this occasion, our Chief, Dr. Moxey Mims, is going to present on disparities in pediatric kidney disease. So without further ado, Dr. Moxey Mims.
Am I on? Okay. So good morning. As Dr. Margill stated, this is World Kidney Day. It's actually tomorrow, but we're going to take advantage of it today since this is the day for grand rounds. And while the focus of World Kidney Day this year is kidney disease in women, that's not going to be the focus of my talk, primarily because in children, it's actually not the case that there's more in girls than boys. It tends to be more in boys in general. But I'd like to focus on disparities in pediatric kidney disease, racial ethnic disparities, because I think that's particularly apropos for the population that we serve. So here's the outline. First, I'm going to tell you a bit about chronic kidney disease progression to end-stage kidney disease. And then I want to talk about what some of you may have heard in the literature, the big topic right now, the issue of ApoL1, the apolipoprotein L1 impact on chronic kidney disease progression in people of African descent. Do an overview of the end-stage renal disease trends in the U.S., including transplantation outcomes, look at the potential impact of ApoL1 in that situation, and then talk briefly about some differences that are not explained by ApoL1, so differences that are not biologic. Before I start, though, I figured we should do some basic definitions. A disparity being a difference or lack of equality, and particularly a health disparity being a health difference that adversely affects specific populations. And that can be manifested as either higher disease incidence or prevalence or higher mortality as a result of that particular disease. And for the non-nephrologist, I'd like to define what chronic kidney disease and end-stage renal disease are. So chronic kidney disease, the official definition is that it's an abnormality of kidney structure or function that's present for more than 3 months and has implications for health. As you can imagine, in pediatrics, this requirement for 3 months does not apply if you're talking about a neonate or an infant who's less than 3 months of age. And CKD is generally divided into 5 stages. What we call end-stage renal disease, or some people call end-stage kidney disease, is the last stage of chronic kidney disease, and it includes patients who are being treated by either dialysis or transplantation. So with that, we'll move on to our first overview of CKD progression to end-stage kidney disease. Now, I included this slide because it makes the point that the chronic kidney disease that you see in pediatrics can have multiple effects at multiple time points. So we start here prenatally, and we know, we have the Fetal Medicine Institute here, and we get calls for consults there with women who are found to have abnormalities in the kidneys of the fetus, going into infancy and childhood and adolescence and into adult. So you can have kidney disease developing at any of these points here, and certainly if it starts here, it can stay on into adulthood. So I just wanted to make the case that we're talking a continuum and not absolute discrete time points. The other point I'd like to make is that the kidney disease etiologies that you see in children are very different than what you see in adults. So these data are old, but they haven't really changed, and there hasn't been an update to this table since 2008. But you can see that the majority of kidney disease in children are developmental issues, and then glomerulonephritis. And I also want to point out here the difference when you start looking between races. 39.5% of those with focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and I'll come back to this, are Black, even though they make up only 18.6% of the chronic kidney disease group. So I want you to keep that in mind. And when you look at who progresses to end-stage kidney disease, you see focal segmental glomerulosclerosis is right at the top here. Most of these developmental nephropathies occur at a much lower level. Again, keep that in mind as we go along. There's a study called CKID that some of you may be aware of, and it's a longitudinal prospective study of children with chronic kidney disease, and currently has just under 900 children enrolled. And looking at that population, while African American kids make up about 22, 23% of the CKID population, they make up 31% of those who have glomerular disease, with the biggest one in that group being the focal segmental glomerulosclerosis I pointed out. They make up 19% of those with non-glomerular disease. And I'll show you why that's important. What's been discerned as you look and follow the children who are in the CKID cohort is that those with glomerular disease and those with non-glomerular disease, those developmental issues, progress to end stage at a very different rate. Those with glomerular disease progress much faster, as you can see here, compared to those with non-glomerular disease. And again, thinking back to what I showed you, who are the people who tend to have more glomerular disease? This is from adults, but I think it still makes a good point, and that is that racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to progress to end-stage renal disease. You can see here the progression rate for people who are African American, but also that it's high for Native Americans, it's higher in Asians, it's higher with people of Hispanic ethnicity. So the lifetime risk for ESRD is about 2% in whites, it's about 7.5% in Black. Why is that important? It's important because if you look at the life expectancy of people who have end-stage renal disease compared to those in the general population, these are the years of life expectancy that are lost. So this is our population. Those who develop and get to end-stage kidney disease between the ages of 0 and 14 lose more than 50 years of life expectancy. Even those 20 to 24, you're talking losing more than 40 years of life expectancy, and you can see as a downtrend. So now the big deal about this apolipoprotein L1 or ApoL1. Prior to this being, I don't want to say discovered, but described, a lot of what I've talked about in terms of progression of chronic kidney disease to end-stage kidney disease and the incidence of chronic kidney disease in minority populations, and particularly in the African-American population, a lot of it was written off as, oh, it's socioeconomic status, it's access to care, it's, you know, you name it. There were many, many theories. But even when people started looking at those, people of equal socioeconomic status with racial differences progressed at a different rate. So people knew that there was more to it than just socioeconomic status. And there was a study that the NIDDK had funded looking at diabetic nephropathy, and they happened to be in that study looking for genetic markers that would indicate progression of diabetic nephropathy. And they weren't able to find anything. But serendipitously, they discovered this gene at that time, MYH1, that they found was highly correlated to progression. It was later found that it actually was not MYH1, but a gene right next to it or very close to it on the chromosome, the gene for ApoL1, that's highly correlated. So just a few things about APOL1. It's a serum factor that lyses trypanosomes located on chromosome 22q12, and it's found that 12 to 14% of African Americans carry two high-risk alleles, two alleles that are mutated. It has a recessive pattern of inheritance, and even more striking, these high-risk variants are almost non-existent in other ethnicities. The gene only exists in humans and higher primates, and the thought is that there must be some interaction with other genes or some type of interaction with the environment that sets someone up for the development of kidney disease. So what's the connection with APOL1? What we now know, remember that first bullet on my last slide, I said that it helps to lyse trypanosomes. And so what's been found in terms of the pattern and the theory is that this mutation evolved over time as a protection against African sleeping sickness. So if you think of it almost like a corollary of the sickle cell and malaria story. So it has this protective effect for the trypanosomiasis, but then sets you up for a negative effect in the same way that sickle cell disease is a negative effect when you're not trying to defend yourself against malaria. The risk alleles, looking at case control studies, you can see that the odds ratio or the relative risk for a multitude of kidney diseases is markedly elevated when you have these high-risk alleles. It's particularly striking for HIV-associated nephropathy, which I'm not going to talk about today, and we have Dr. Ray here, who's an expert on the HIV-associated nephropathy. But that one is the most striking because in HIV nephropathy is almost exclusively a disease that's seen in African American children. It's almost not described in non-African or African American children. So it's a really, really striking risk. Now, this doesn't explain everything, but it certainly starts to give us some clues into some of the biologic issues that may be going on. Here again, because I like these types of pictures that show the life course, that shows the relevance of pediatric disease to later life. And you can see all of these types of kidney diseases that have been associated with high-risk APOL1 variants across the life course. This one with preeclampsia, I don't think there are any studies yet that have demonstrated it in humans, but there are some mice models where when the APOL1 high-risk alleles are introduced, the mice do develop preeclampsia. So that's something that's going to require further studies. There are two studies that then joined forces to look at this a little bit more. I've described the CKID study to you. The other is called Neptune, which is a study of people, both adults and children, with nephrotic syndrome. And the decision was we should look at whether or not the children in these studies who have FSGS, do they have a higher prevalence of these high-risk alleles of APOL1? So the CKID study, which is all children, they looked at the number of African-American children in the study, those who had their APOL1 genotyping done, the number of those that had glomerular disease, and looked at those who had the low-risk allele versus high-risk. Similarly with Neptune, except these with adults and children, they pulled out just the children who had APOL1 genotype. There were 48 of them, and divided them into those who had low risk or high risk. These were the ages that these kids entered the respective studies. What they found was, in the case of the Neptune study, those who had the high-risk allele and had FSGS, the odds ratio was 5.7. In C-KID, it was 25. The other thing that was looked at was the incidence of prematurity. And for Neptune, people who had a history of being premature had an odds ratio of 2.7 versus 9.6 for C-KID. And you might ask, well, what does that have to do with anything? Why did you all look at prematurity? In the C-KID study earlier, as we looked at data, we found that the percentage of children who were in the C-KID study, so children in that study with chronic kidney disease, who had a history of being born premature, was almost 3 times what you would see in the general population. So this link between prematurity and chronic kidney disease, so we wanted to see was there a link between prematurity and the FSGS prematurity and this APOL1 genotype. Now, the thought behind prematurity having a link with chronic kidney disease is that when you look at when kidney development starts in utero and when it ends, if you're significantly premature, you're being born before your kidneys have had a chance to mature. So the theory is that you have less nephrons. The fewer nephrons that you have now have to work harder, so you've been set up for potentially developing chronic kidney disease. They also looked at how fast these kids progressed with their chronic kidney disease. If you looked at those who had the low risk versus the high risk, and this is the change in their eGFR or the change in their kidney function per year. You can see that the high risk folks were losing kidney function at about 18% per year compared to the low risk, about half of that. The same in the Neptune study. The folks in the Neptune study had better kidney function because it's not a study of chronic kidney disease, it's just a study of nephrotic syndrome. So a lot of these folks did not have chronic kidney disease. But when they started to lose their kidney function, you can see that the ones with the high-risk allele lost their function at a much greater rate than those with the low-risk allele. So the summary of the C-KID and Neptune study was that the African-American children who had this high-risk APOL1 genotype and glomerular disease were likely to be older at disease onset, had an increased risk of premature birth, and presented with a lower GFR at baseline and had faster progression. So the thought was, well, maybe the prematurity is this second hit. One of the things I forgot to mention with APOL1 is that it's not an absolute risk for kidney disease. It's an increased risk. Not everybody with a high-risk allele develops kidney disease. And the thought is that, as I mentioned, there may be gene-gene interaction, gene-environment interaction. So the thought is maybe prematurity is one of these second hits that can lead to kidney disease. So what the investigators did was to look at 2 publicly available databases of premature birth in African Americans. One was called the GINA study, which is a gene and environmental interaction study, and one is the Boston Medical Center study. So they looked at mothers and infants and did APOL1 typing on them to see was there a correlation. There was not. As you can see, all of these boxes line up. You look at the weeks of gestation, you look at the gestational weight, low risk, high risk alleles, the same in all of these boxes. So there was no correlation with the APOL1 high risk allele in this instance. So the conceptual frameworks are that perhaps the high risk APOL1 plus prematurity can lead to glomerular disease, or it may be that there are other insults that lead to prematurity that also, when combined, lead to glomerular disease. So it was felt as if this study might support the theory from the prior one that prematurity is a second hit. So let's talk about end-stage renal disease trends in the U.S. I put this up. This is the graph for everybody in the U.S. with end-stage renal disease. people with end-stage renal disease in the U.S. are put in a mandatory registry, the USRDS, United States Renal Data System. So there are really good data because you have to put the data in. And I put this up because here's our population. So you can see why in certain circumstances people look at pediatric kidney disease and they go, what's the big deal? This is incidence. This is prevalence. Again, we're way down here. If you look at the incidence by race, Blacks are here. I think this is Native Hawaiians. I can't see real well up here. I think this is Native Hawaiians, American Indians, Asians, and whites down here, okay? So what does this tell you? This is a disease of minorities. If you look at ethnicity, Hispanic versus non-Hispanic, again, a disease of ethnic minorities. This is the trend by race, and it seems as if it's going up still in Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. In Blacks, we seem to be leveling off a little bit, and in Asians, it seems to be trending down a bit. Again, pointing out Hispanic, non-Hispanic, prevalent. So here we are with the picture with children, taking that, what looked like a flat line at the bottom, and blowing it up a little bit. This, though, is not showing by race. This is showing by the type of dialysis or if they're getting transplant, looking at the incidence based on modality. So here is hemodialysis, peritoneal dialysis, transplant. Prevalence. Again, this is transplant, hemodialysis, peritoneal dialysis, and the overall prevalence trend. So then we look at modality by race. In Black or African Americans, hemodialysis, which was the curve that was at the top for the incidence and prevalence by modality, hemodialysis. Little lower in whites, lower in the category of other. Transplant up here. The distribution of the incidence by the primary cause, and you probably already know the punchline on this one because I showed you earlier that glomerulonephritis and secondary and primary glomerulonephritis here in the older age group, not so much in the younger age group. Recall congenital anomalies are going to be our biggest factor here in the younger age group. So the rates of living a deceased donor transplant in pediatric patients, Black or African American, white, what you see here. The mean time on the waiting list from hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis to the first transplant started out very different. This, in general, has trended down, partly due to some changes that were made in the way kidneys are allocated to children compared to adults, and it benefited all children. And you saw the most dramatic improvement, actually, for Blacks and for Hispanics as well, based on, I'm forgetting the name of the rule, 35, what was it called? Share 35, thank you, which said that kidneys from deceased donors who were 35 years or younger, children would be prioritized to receive those kidneys because they would need kidneys longer than people who are older. So FSGS that I touched on earlier, when we look now at once you get a transplant, how long does it last? And there was a study published in 2016 that looked at just those with FSGS. Again, this very high-risk group for developing end-stage kidney disease in the first place. And when they looked, you see that the Black kids lost their graft faster than the other racial groups. They found that the graft survival was significantly shorter. They had a higher risk of acute rejection and of delayed graft function. One of the things that sometimes causes people to lose their transplant if they have FSGS is the disease recurs in the transplant. And they found that there was no significant difference in disease recurrence, so that wasn't why the kidneys were being lost. But if you look just in general, this isn't something unique to the FSGS diagnosis. This is Nephropathy data from 2014, and looking at deceased donor and living donor, again, you see the trends here. Black kids who get a transplant, their transplants just don't last as long. And it's particularly bothersome when you're talking about a living-related transplant. One would say, well, with the deceased donors, you could see that, but why aren't they doing well with the living-related transplants either? So let's talk about, go back to APOL1 again and what they're doing in the transplant. This is a study that was published by Barry Friedman a couple of years ago. And so they decided to look at this question, why is it that Blacks who receive a kidney transplant, and this is adult data, not pediatric, why do the kidneys not last as long? So they started asking the question, could APOL1 have an impact here as well? So they did the genotyping on, I think it was like 1,500 or so transplanted adults. And what they found was if you had 0 or just one of these risk variants, you progress to lose your kidney at this rate. But if you had 2 high-risk variants, you lost at a significantly higher rate. Why is this? I'll come back to that. His theory was that perhaps what we're seeing is people who donate a kidney who may have the 2 risk alleles, and it has not yet manifested disease in them because, you know, time hasn't gone along enough and they're still young enough when they donate these kidneys that maybe the disease manifests later on. Theory, we don't know for sure. So this is a study that's going to get underway, hopefully this summer, called the Apollo study. And the intent of this study is to hopefully answer that question. The study I showed you previously was a retrospective look. So now we're going to look prospectively. The intent is to look at every single kidney that's donated from an African American, no matter whom it's donated to, and to track those kidneys, to do the APOL1 genotyping and see if you have 2 risk variants, does it hold true based on this retrospective study that the graft will be lost at an earlier time? More importantly, I think, they're going to follow the donors, because the question then comes up, if you have 2 risk alleles and you donate your kidney, is that kidney donation now your second hit and you're set up to develop kidney disease yourself? One of the things that we've done, and I'm saying we, I'm steering committee chair for this study, and one thing that was done was to put together a community advisory council. We asked all of the sites that were funded to nominate 2 patients or patients' relatives to be on this council to advise us in terms of how we move forward with this, and they've been incredibly helpful. But one of the most poignant things for me was when we had our meeting with them and we had them all stand and tell us about themselves. And two of the people on this panel had donated kidneys to their relatives and then subsequently ended up with end-stage kidney disease and had to receive a kidney themselves. Now, the good thing, if one could say good thing, is because of the way kidneys are allocated, if you find yourself in that situation, you are given priority for an organ. But I personally had never come across that situation, and to have 2 out of 20 people stand up and say, I was a kidney donor and now I'm a kidney recipient was really quite striking to me. So that's one of the things that we hope to find out from this study. We're not telling people not to donate. Can you imagine, if you're a parent, you might think, even if there's a risk for me, I would still want to give my kidney to my child. So we're hoping to sort this all out and see where this leads us, what we learn from this. So that's why I put the proceed with caution. A couple of the people on the panel were concerned that doing this study, if we find that having a kidney with 2 risk alleles transplanted into you, that your kidney might not last as long, would that put a stigma on people? And folks would refuse to accept a kidney with those 2 risk alleles? Or would it discourage people from donating because of those concerns? And I think those concerns are valid, but they can only be resolved, I think, by actually doing the study and seeing, and by educating people about what it is we're trying to find out. I think, I feel that we have clinical equipoise and we do not know the answers, and so, I would not associate myself with the study if I thought we already knew the answers. So stay tuned. We hope to get this study underway, like I said, this summer. So finally, differences that are not explained by APOL1. This is a paper that was published, again, using data from the CKID study. So I asked the epidemiologist, the data coordinating center, kept this thing going around and around that African-American kids progressed faster and we couldn't figure out why, and it didn't always seem to be related to APOL1. So I said, is there a way that we can tease this out? And this guy, Derek Ng, who's the first author on this paper, is just the smartest person. So what he said we could do, and what we ended up doing, was to take the group of children in the CKID study who do not have glomerular disease. So we take APOL1 out of the mix. APOL1 is associated with glomerular disease. It's not associated with those other diseases that I pointed out to you. And I'm not a statistician, but he did this fancy thing called the inverse probability weighting, which I don't understand all of it, but what it does is it equalizes things. So basically what they do is to look at the non-African American kids, the African American kids with non-glomerular kidney disease, and it kind of equalizes all those socioeconomic differences and everything else and says, now if we make everything otherwise equal, what happens? So interestingly, without that statistical trick, as it were, of equalizing everything, this is the time from the incidence of first renal replacement. So you can see in African-American kids who entered into the study, it took about 3.2 years to get to, my numbers aren't showing up here. But if you go with this, it took 17 to 20% shorter time for renal replacement therapy in the African-American kids versus the non-African-American kids. Well, once you did the weighting, that difference was no longer significant. So it says that a lot of what may be going on here has to do with other factors, non-biological factors that we're seeing. And I mentioned at the beginning, socioeconomic and the rest of those don't account for everything, but we can't completely discount them. However, what I found much more interesting was if you looked then at the incidence to first dialysis or transplant at competing events, the relative time to transplant in the non-African American kids, in the African American children was 62% longer to get to transplant and 47% faster to get to dialysis. So why are they getting to dialysis faster but transplant slower? What's going on? And so then he did the same trick of the weighting, and I was hoping that all this would go away, and it didn't. So still 54% time to transplant, 38% time faster to dialysis. So what's going on? Is it decisions that people are making, or the African American kids and families not necessarily being encouraged as quickly to go to transplant? Is there something else going on, other things? Are they sicker? What may be going on here? Looked at another way, African American kids were less likely to receive transplant after dialysis even. So looking at this here, 57% of the non-African American kids, and of course these numbers are small, but if you're getting statistically significantly different results with these small numbers, imagine with bigger numbers. And so the time to transplant after their first dialysis for the African American kids, they waited an average of 1.19 years. And of course, this is just in the C-KID study, so this is a snapshot. This is not everyone in the U.S. 0.41 years in the non-African American kids to wait for transplant. So I'll just let that sink in for a second. Again, why is this important? I showed you a graph earlier about the number of years of life lost depending on how old you are when you go to end-stage renal disease. This is looking at it in a little different way, expected remaining lifetime in years by modality. So if you've got dialysis versus transplant compared to the general population. Look at that difference all through. If you get dialysis first as opposed to getting transplanted first. And who's getting dialysis first? However, a good piece of news that I'm really proud of, not that I had anything to do with it, it preceded me coming here, and Dr. Modgill and the transplant team can, you know, stand tall and be very proud of this. The UNOS benchmarking data that recently came out that's looking at transplants from November 2016 to October 2017. This is Children's Hospital. We serve a minority population, right? These are our transplant kids. 31% Black, 36% Hispanic, versus other hospitals for in Region 2 versus the national average. But what I'm even more proud of is this graph. This is the median waiting time for recipients of deceased donor. At Children's, it was 112.5 days as the median. Remember that graph I showed you from just C-KID over a year for the African American kids? So 112 versus almost 300 days for Region 2 and over 200 days nationally. I think we're doing something right. We're serving our minority population. I hope we continue to serve them in that way, and that we push for what's right for these kids in terms of giving them the best opportunity for longevity. So to conclude, minority populations bear a disproportionate burden of CKD and ESRD, even in the pediatric age range. We now know there's some specific biologic factors that can impact this, but there are probably a whole bunch of non-biologic factors that impact this, including our attitudes to how we treat these kids. And so I would say that care should be exercised and be mindful of both of these types of risk factors in these kids as we make decisions about their care going forward. So I'll stop there and answer any questions. You're not allowed to ask me questions. Yes, Patricia.
Islanders and high prevalence of renal disease. That was very interesting. Do you know, is that for children too? Do they have more obstructive uropathies or diseases or what?
But I don't know. In fact, that's only recently started showing up on the USRDS tables. That didn't even used to be on the USRDS tables. It used to all be lumped with they used to lump, I think, the American Indians and Alaska Natives and the Native Hawaiians and all those used to be lumped together. They've now started breaking that out, and people are starting to ask exactly the question you are. There's so much to be looked at there now that they're teasing it out. So I have no idea in terms of what they're seeing in children. I mean, for the longest time, I think until a couple of years ago, there wasn't even a pediatric nephrologist in Hawaii, and I kept trying to volunteer to be the pediatric nephrologist in Hawaii, but there were no takers.
Barbara, that was really just spectacular. Thank you so much for that. Really terrific. And thank you in particular for making the APOL1 story so clear to all of us. I do have a question, though, and it's kind of a general question about the double hit hypothesis that you talked about with prematurity. What are some of the factors related to prematurity that actually contribute to increased risk for chronic kidney disease in that population?
So there's several. One is the whole point that you're born before your kidneys are fully developed. We used to be taught that at birth, nephronogenesis completely stops. There are now data that say maybe in those really, really very premature infants, it continues for a little while post-birth. Then they're born, they go to the NICU, they get a lot of meds that they need to save their lives but can be toxic to their kidneys. They can have a lot, they have AKI on top of this. So here you've got now fewer nephrons to start with. If you have some that are still trying to develop and they get an insult on top of that, then you're getting even fewer nephrons. There are studies that show that preemies have a higher incidence of acute kidney injury, and certainly the adult literature and now some of the pediatric literature is showing that that insult of acute kidney injury earlier on sets you up for chronic kidney disease later on. So it's multifactorial. There's no one thing that's leading to that.
I'd like to second Stephen's point. This is a wonderful lecture. Congratulations, and congratulations to all the nephrology division for the work that you've been doing. Mine is a very basic question, which is, what does APOL1 do? Is it just an association, or is it causative? And if it's causative, what are speculated to be that the gene does?
That's a $50 million question that a ton of people are working on right now to figure out what it does. What we know is that it's expressed in the podocyte, which is one of the cells sitting on the glomerulus, And the podocyte is certainly one of the major focuses of where there's damage in glomerular disease. So people are avidly working, trying to figure out how this happens. And as I mentioned, because the gene is only found in humans and higher primates, people are having to knock in this gene as opposed to knock it out and figure out what's going on. So the jury is still out on exactly what it's doing. The thought is that it's a progressor and may not be necessarily a primary cause of disease, but sets you up to have disease progression when you get the so-called second hit. But the pathophysiology has yet to be worked out.
Hi, I'm Shari Ogunlesi, pulmonary. Thank you so much. That was very enlightening, like Stephen said. But I'd like you to comment on the reports that APOL1 is more prevalent in sickle cell trait patients and who also reportedly have high incidence of kidney disease. Is that something that's seen in our children as well? Do we look for the trait in some of these, in the patients that you've referred to, the African American children? Certainly in the areas of Africa that you showed, the incidence of prevalence of sickle cell trait is very high.
One of the slides that I showed earlier, there are data now coming out that says there is not an interaction necessarily between APOL1 and sickle cell trait. They found that kids with sickle cell trait who have a lot of proteinuria and can go on to CKD also may have higher prevalence of APOL1. But in one of the studies that's out there, they said that the risk was equal in terms of if you had sickle cell disease and if you had APOL1, but they couldn't truly demonstrate an interaction of the two. Now, from the CKID data, I can't answer that. There were only 9 kids in the CKID study who had sickle cell trait, and I can certainly go back and ask if any of those kids also had high-risk APOL1 variants. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. But there is some overlap in the areas in Africa where you see the sleeping sickness and malaria, but it doesn't completely overlap.
Hi, Marva. Thank you for your talk. It was very inspirational. My question is pretty basic. I'm really impressed by our numbers and our ability to get transplants as soon as a little over 100 days. What are our key strategies to be able to get the days down to that level compared to others?
I will have to turn that over to Dr. Modgill. I think one of the strategies is getting kids listed as early as possible and not waiting until the very last minute. But I'm going to let Asha take that one. It's on.
It's on. Okay. Yeah, I don't think we know the exact answer, but I think some of the strategies we imply is come with experience. We are one of the higher number performing transplant centers, and with time you develop confidence that the kidneys we are choosing for children are the right one. Some of these kidneys may be turned down because you aren't confident, is it good enough for the kid or not? As you build experience, by experience you know this is going to work, we have to select it. So that brings down the number of days to transplantation if you're willing to accept kidneys which other centers may turn it down. I think that's what we think is going on here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.